Are you interested in angels, demons, ghosts, spirits, and monsters? Are you curious about their origins, tales, and influence upon history and on the present day? If so, then sit back, relax, and welcome to Southern Demonology, the podcast that explores all of this and more.
Hello all, and welcome back to another episode of Southern Demonology. As always, I am your friendly neighborhood ancient demonologist JJ, or perhaps for tonight, let's call myself your ancient angelologist. Tonight, we are going to look at a subject that is both very familiar and at the same time much less straightforward than people usually assume. Most Christians have heard of archangels. Most have at least heard the names Michael and Gabriel, and many, depending on their background, also know Raphael and perhaps Uriel. But the moment you begin asking where the idea of archangels actually came from, why so many traditions speak of 7, and why there is still disagreement over which names belong on that list, the whole picture becomes much more interesting. That is what I want to talk about tonight, because as with so many subjects in this show, the problem is not that people know nothing. The problem is that most people inherit a simplified answer long after the history has already become complicated. They assume that archangel has always meant one fixed thing, that the number 7 comes from a single obvious text, and that the names were handed down in a stable and universally agreed upon list. But that is not really what the sources show. The idea develops over time. The language develops over time. The lists develop over time. And if we want to speak carefully, then we need to let that development remain visible rather than flattening it into easy certainty. So I want to start where I usually start, which is with the category itself. What is an archangel? The first thing worth noticing is that the figure of the archangel appears before the technical word becomes standard. The Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible points out that the figure of the archangel already appears in the Hebrew Bible, but the actual Greek term archangelos does not occur in the Greek versions of the Hebrew Bible. Instead, that term appears in early Greek passages of Jewish pseudepigrapha, such as 1st Enoch, and then only twice in the New Testament itself, in 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and Jude 9. That matters because it tells us something very basic about how religious language works. The heavenly reality, or at least the idea of a class of chief angels, is older than the point at which people begin using a settled label for it. That should not surprise us. It happens all the time. A concept can exist for quite a while before a specific technical term becomes common. So when someone says, well, the word archangel hardly appears in Scripture, the careful response is that the word is indeed relatively rare, but the idea of exalted chief angels is older and broader than that. The dictionary goes on to say that in Jewish literature from the Second Temple period, there is a strong tendency to distinguish categories of angels and to introduce a more explicit hierarchy into the angelic world. Some scholars have suggested Persian influence here, especially in relation to the idea of 7 exalted angels standing in the divine presence, while others have suggested Babylonian influence. The dictionary remains cautious, but it is quite clear that by this period certain angels are functioning as individual heavenly powers with distinct roles, especially Michael and Gabriel, who are treated as among the highest angels in the hierarchy. That is one of the major turning points. Earlier biblical texts know heavenly messengers, heavenly hosts, cherubim, seraphim, and divine attendants. But later, Jewish literature becomes much more interested in naming, ranking, grouping, and specifying function. At that point, you are no longer dealing merely with an angel appearing in a given scene. You are dealing with a structured heavenly court in which certain named beings occupy especially exalted positions. Early roots in the Hebrew Bible. Now, if you ask where the roots of this idea are in the Hebrew Bible itself, one important precursor is Joshua 5, where Joshua encounters the captain of the host of the Lord. The dictionary notes that the Greek tradition uses a term related to archistrategos, chief commander, which can overlap conceptually with later archangel language. It also notes that in Daniel and in the Qumran text, the prince of the heavenly host may still be something of an independent figure who only later becomes identified more explicitly with Michael or another archangel. But Daniel is really where the category begins to sharpen in a way most listeners will recognize. In Daniel, you already have two exalted named angels. Michael appears as one of the chief princes and the protector of Israel, while Gabriel appears as the angelic interpreter who explains visions and prophecies. The dictionary specifically highlights Michael as one of the chief princes in the context of the heavenly conflict among the angelic powers of the nations, and Gabriel as the angelus interpretis, the revealing angel for the seer. That is a significant step. Once the heavenly world includes named figures with recurring roles, it becomes much easier for later apocalyptic literature to expand the category. Michael can become the warrior and protector. Gabriel can become the revealer and announcer. Raphael can become the healer. Uriel can become the illuminating interpreter of hidden things. And once that process is underway, lists begin to emerge. Why do so many traditions say there are 7? This is probably the question most people bring to the topic, and the answer is that the number 7 emerges from several overlapping sources rather than one simple proof text. The dictionary notes that groups of special angels, usually 4 or 7, appear in Jewish and early Christian literature, and that Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael usually belong to these groups when names are given. It then points to Ezekiel 9, where 7 angels appear as executors of divine punishment, and to Tobit 12:15, where Raphael identifies himself as one of the 7 angels who present the prayers of the holy ones and enter the glorious presence of the Lord. It also points to 1 Enoch 20, which gives a list of 7 angels by name. That means the number 7 is not arbitrary, but neither is it based on only one isolated line of tradition. It emerges because 7 already carries symbolic weight in Jewish thought as a number of fullness, order, and heavenly completion, and because multiple texts reinforce the idea of a group of 7 chief angels associated with divine presence, mediation, judgment, and liturgical service. At the same time, 7 is not the only number in play. The dictionary also says that 1 Enoch 9 preserves the oldest extant list of 4 archangels: Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel. It goes on to note that Uriel often replaces Sariel in later lists of 4, and that, in the book of parables in 1 Enoch, Phanuel can appear where Uriel might otherwise be expected. So, before the sevenfold lists become dominant, there is already an important older stream in which the chief angels are imagined as 4 around the throne. That is a very important detail because it tells us that the tradition did not begin with one universally fixed 7-name roster that everyone later preserved. Instead, there were multiple organizing patterns. 4 and 7 both mattered. Some names were stable, others rotated. Now I want to spend some time on the names, because angelic names are one of the places where theology, language, and later interpretation all meet. Most of these names end in El, which is the Old Northwest Semitic divine element referring to El, the high god, who in Israelite and later Jewish usage is of course identified with the God of Israel. The dictionary notes that these angelic names proliferate in the Hellenistic period, and that the names themselves are typically archaic theophoric forms ending with El. It also notes that while they look archaic, there is no firm evidence that the names themselves are necessarily older than the Hellenistic period simply because they sound ancient. That is worth keeping in mind. A name can be built in an old pattern without that proving that the figure or the exact form of the name is primordial. Still, the names do mean things, and the meanings are often revealing. Michael is traditionally broken down as Mikael, usually rendered as who is like God. It is framed as a rhetorical question, not an expression of doubt. The point is not that Michael is wondering whether anyone resembles God. The point is that no one does. The name itself has a confrontational, almost polemical quality to it, which fits extremely well with Michael's later role as the heavenly warrior and opponent of rebellious powers. The dictionary emphasizes Michael's role as warrior, protector of Israel, opponent of Satan, and participant in eschatological salvation and final judgment. Gabriel is the most interesting case in some ways. People often gloss it as man of God because of the element Geber or GBR, meaning man, strong man, or mighty one. But the dictionary says it is better taken as God is my hero/warrior. It also notes that Daniel refers to him as the man Gabriel, probably because the element for man is audible in the name itself. And this leads directly to a question I wanted to address explicitly. Why is Gabriel primarily a revealer if his name sounds martial? That is a very good question, because at first glance, the name and the role do not seem to match. If Gabriel means something like God is my warrior or God is my hero, why does he show up above all as interpreter, announcer, and revealer? The first answer is that names do not always function like job descriptions. A name can preserve one aspect of a figure's symbolic identity while the literature emphasizes another. The second answer, however, is that Gabriel is not actually only a revealer. The dictionary says his primary function is indeed that of revealer, especially in Daniel and Luke, but it also notes that he has a militant role. In 1 Enoch 10, he is charged to proceed against the offspring of the Watchers. In 1 Enoch 54:6, the archangels cast the wicked into the furnace of judgment. In the War Scroll, the names of the archangels are inscribed on shields and towers for the final battle. And if the revealing angel of Daniel 10 is Gabriel, then he is also standing with Michael against the heavenly princes of Persia and Greece. So the tension is not really that Gabriel's name means warrior, while his role means revealer. The truth is that the tradition presents him as both. He reveals because he is a trusted heavenly messenger, and he fights because he is one of the exalted powers of the divine court. The revealing function simply became the most memorable one in Daniel and Luke. Raphael is usually broken down as Raphael, meaning God heals or healing of God. Even though the dictionary material in the file we searched does not give a separate etymology paragraph for Raphael, his role in Tobit and in the broader sevenfold tradition makes the meaning of the name especially fitting. In Tobit, he heals Tobit's blindness, protects the family, and identifies himself as one of the seven who stand before God. Uriel is traditionally taken as Uriel, usually rendered God is my light, or light of God. The dictionary emphasizes Uriel's role as a revealing angel, one who knows and discloses hidden things, especially the places of punishment and the imprisonment of rebellious stars. It also notes that in later tradition, Uriel remains especially important as an angelus interpres, the heavenly interpreter of mysteries, for example in 4 Ezra. This is one of the reasons Uriel remains so beloved in apocalyptic and mystical traditions. His name and his function fit each other almost too well. He is an angel of illumination, disclosure, and insight. Raguel is commonly taken as friend of God or God's friend. He appears in the sevenfold list in 1 Enoch 20 preserved by the dictionary's Archangel entry. In Enochic literature, he is often connected with order, justice, and oversight. That traditional meaning fits well enough, though I would still speak a bit cautiously because later readers sometimes overconfidently lock down these name meanings more firmly than the evidence always warrants. Sariel is usually broken down as Sariel and is often rendered Prince of God or Command of God. The dictionary is especially important here because it says that Sariel belongs to the oldest tradition of the 4 archangels, even though later lists often replace him with Uriel or Phanuel. That makes Sariel one of those names that has stronger early credentials than modern familiarity. Remiel, sometimes appearing in related forms, is usually taken as Thunder of God, Mercy of God, or something along those lines depending on which root people emphasize. The dictionary includes him in the sevenfold list of 1 Enoch 20, but also warns more generally against careless collapsing of similar angelic names across languages and textual traditions. So I would treat the common meaning tradition as plausible, but not build too much on it. Phanuel is a little different because it comes through Greek transcription of a Semitic name usually rendered Penuel or Peniel, meaning face of God. The dictionary says that in some passages of 1 Enoch, Phanuel replaces Uriel as the 4th archangel. That alone makes the name extremely important for understanding how fluid the lists can be. A name meaning face of God is, of course, very fitting for an exalted heavenly being who stands in the divine presence. Jeremiel is usually taken to mean mercy of God, or God will have compassion. The dictionary notes that Jeremiel appears in 4 Ezra 4:36 as one of the additional archangelic names outside the better-known core lists. He is one of those names that demonstrates how the category of archangel could expand beyond the major sevenfold or fourfold frameworks. Dokiel is often glossed as justice of God or judgment of God. The dictionary notes that Dokiel appears in the longer recension of the Testament of Abraham as another archangelic figure outside the main standard rosters. Again, this is important not because Dokiel became universally famous, but because his existence shows that the archangel category was not always closed. Now that we have looked at the names, let me come back to the structure of the lists. The dictionary says that the oldest extant list of 4 archangels appears in 1 Enoch 9:1, Michael, Sariel, Raphael, and Gabriel. It also says that this group of 4 probably developed from the imagery of the 4 living creatures in Ezekiel 1, standing on the 4 sides of the divine throne. These 4 praise before the Lord, pray on behalf of the righteous, intercede for the souls of the dead righteous, and play an important role at the final judgment. That is a very rich picture. The 4 archangels are not random names. They are throne attendants, intercessors, and agents of judgment. And if that really is the older configuration, then the later sevenfold pattern did not replace a vacuum. It expanded an already meaningful structure. Then, in 1 Enoch 20, you get the famous sevenfold list: Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Sariel, Gabriel, and Remiel. The dictionary notes that some witnesses list only 6 names explicitly, but still refer to 7 archangels, while the Ethiopic tradition preserves the sevenfold pattern clearly. That is where Ethiopic literature becomes so important. Why Ethiopic literature matters so much. If you want the broader archangelic world, rather than the narrowed down version most Christians inherit, Ethiopic literature is indispensable. The reason is simple. First, Enoch survived as living scripture in Ethiopic Christianity, which means the names and roles preserved there did not become merely antiquarian data. They remain part of a living religious imagination. That matters because in many other Christian traditions, the wider Enochic inheritance became much more marginal. Michael and Gabriel remained highly visible because they appear in widely recognized canonical texts. Raphael remained visible where Tobit remained canonical or influential. But names like Raguel, Sariel, Remiel, and Phanuel survived much more fully in traditions that continued to receive Enochic material directly. And that is one of the reasons discussions of archangels can feel so different depending on which stream of tradition a person is coming from. If your imagination is formed almost entirely by the most widely recognized biblical canon, then the roster is narrow. If your imagination is formed by the broader apocalyptic and Ethiopic tradition, then the roster is wider and more textured. The material from Enoch is especially important here because the archangels are not merely decorative. In 1 Enoch 9 and 10, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel stand before God, respond to the corruption unleashed by the Watchers, and then receive distinct assignments. One is sent to warn Noah, one is sent to heal the earth, one is sent against the illicit offspring of the Watchers, and one is sent to bind the rebellious powers. That differentiated set of tasks helps explain why later traditions became so attached to the idea that chief angels have particular domains and responsibilities. At this point, the answer should already be becoming clearer. Only a handful of archangelic names are broadly agreed upon because only a handful achieved wide canonical, liturgical, and devotional survival. The dictionary explicitly says that Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael are the constant members of the major lists, while the fourth member of the list of 4 can vary, with Uriel and Phanuel often appearing in that position and Sariel belonging to the oldest tradition. That is why those first 3 names are so stable across Christian traditions. Michael and Gabriel are named in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Raphael is securely anchored in Tobit. Once you get beyond that trio, you depend much more heavily on apocalyptic books, Enochic literature, mystical texts, or regionally preserved traditions. Those names are real and ancient, but they did not all enjoy the same degree of universal liturgical reinforcement. Then, over time, some churches became more cautious about speculative multiplication of angelic names. That caution did not erase the wider traditions, but it did mean that ordinary devotional life increasingly focused on the names that were most securely anchored in received scripture and liturgy. So the wider list remained in texts and traditions, but fewer ordinary believers retained them. Michael, Gabriel, and the center of gravity. That narrowing process also helps explain why Michael and Gabriel became so dominant. Michael is unusually durable because his portfolio is so broad. The dictionary presents him as warrior, protector of Israel, opponent of Satan, and participant in eschatological salvation and judgment. In Daniel, he is one of the chief princes and the defender of God's people. In Jude 9, he is explicitly called the Archangel in a dispute with the devil. In Revelation 12, he leads the heavenly battle against the dragon. Gabriel, on the other hand, became unforgettable because he is the great revealer. The dictionary says that his primary function is that of revealer. In Daniel, he interprets visions. In Luke, he announces the births of John the Baptist and Jesus. But, as we saw earlier, he is not merely a gentle messenger. He also has militant and judicial dimensions, especially in Enochic and apocalyptic literature. So Michael and Gabriel together create a kind of center of gravity for archangelic tradition. One embodies heavenly warfare and protection. The other embodies revelation, annunciation, and interpretation, though with real martial strength still attached to him. Later, Christian hierarchy. Now, one final complication has to be addressed, because later Christian theology does something that can confuse the whole discussion if we are not careful. In a lot of early Jewish apocalyptic material, the archangels are simply the highest named angels, the chief heavenly powers around the throne. But later Christian theological tradition, especially under the influence of Pseudo-Dionysius, reorganizes the celestial world into a much more elaborate hierarchy. The dictionary notes that in De Caelesti Hierarchia, the lowest order consists of principalities, archangels, and angels, while higher orders include dominions, authorities, powers, thrones, cherubim, and seraphim. That means archangel does not always function the same way in every stage of tradition. In early apocalyptic thought, the archangels are the chief angels. In later systematic Christian hierarchy, archangels become one order among several and are not necessarily the highest rank. That does not mean one side is right and the other wrong. It means the tradition has moved from narrative and apocalyptic imagery into theological system building. And once that happens, the same word can occupy a different place in the structure. Closing. So if I had to summarize the whole thing as cleanly as possible, I would say it like this. The idea of archangels emerges before the term becomes standard. The roots of the category are already present in exalted heavenly figures in the Hebrew Bible, especially in texts like Joshua and Daniel. During the Second Temple period, Jewish literature becomes much more interested in naming and ranking angels, and certain figures such as Michael and Gabriel emerge as chief heavenly beings with distinct roles. Out of that world come both lists of 4 and lists of 7. Tobit gives us Raphael as one of 7 who stand before God. First, Enoch gives us both a 4-fold and a 7-fold pattern. Ethiopic literature preserves that broader inheritance especially well, including names that became much less familiar elsewhere. Later, Christian theology narrows ordinary devotional awareness around a few major names, while also, in some systems, reorganizing the angelic world into a more elaborate hierarchy. And that is why the subject is simultaneously simpler and more complicated than people think. Simpler, because the broad lines are not impossible to trace. More complicated, because the names, numbers, and hierarchies do not all come from one single moment or one single universally accepted list. So, yes, there is a very old and meaningful reason many traditions speak of 7 archangels. But there is also a very good reason why only a handful of those names are broadly recognized across all Christian traditions. And there is an equally good reason why Ethiopic literature matters so much if you want the larger picture rather than the trimmed down one. In the next episode, we could very easily take one of those names, probably Michael, Gabriel, or Uriel, and do exactly what we have been doing in the Named Being series. Ask where the name first appears, how the role develops, and how much later theology has built on an earlier and smaller foundation. Thank you for listening to Southern Demonology. Stay safe out there.
Thank you for listening to Southern Demonology. Find us online at southerndemonology.com, where you can find all of our social links, including YouTube, TikTok, and Patreon, in addition to listen to episodes and read their transcripts. Also, if you have a moment, please rate this podcast and share it with friends, as nothing can help us grow more.